In a quiet Havana neighborhood, a mother named Yvonne Diaz held her son in an embrace she thought might never come again. You can almost feel it, right? The pure, unfiltered joy of that moment. But that joy was the final move in a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, a game that had pushed her entire country to the very brink of collapse.
And that feeling, that incredible sense of relief, echoed all across Cuba on April 3, 2026. Families torn apart for years were suddenly, unexpectedly, made whole again as hundreds of prisoners walked free. But the story of how they got there, well, it doesn't begin with an act of mercy. It begins with a crisis.
2,010. That's the total number of prisoners pardoned by the Cuban government. It was an absolutely staggering number, something unheard of in recent memory. Officially, they called it a sovereign and humanitarian gesture. But was it really that simple?
The truth, as it so often is, was far more complicated. To really understand what happened, we need to peel back the layers. We have to look at the months leading up to this and the immense, almost unbearable pressure that was squeezing the life out of the island. This wasn't just some political decision, it was a desperate move for survival.
So let's get into it. The island plunges dark, the anatomy of a collapse. In early 2026, Cuba wasn't just struggling, it was teetering on the edge of a full-blown systemic failure. And the root of the problem? It was energy, or to be more precise, a catastrophic lack of it. You don't have to be an economist to see the problem here. The country needed about 100,000 barrels of oil every single day just to function. It was only producing 40,000. That massive gap led to blackouts that lasted 16, sometimes 20 hours a day. Geopolitical risk assessments weren't mincing words. They called it systemic paralysis.
And that paralysis wasn't some abstract concept. It had devastating real-world consequences. We're talking about society itself grinding to a halt. Schools had to close, buses stopped running, hospitals couldn't perform essential surgeries. Even getting clean water became a daily struggle. The whole system was failing, and the UN was already warning of a spiraling humanitarian crisis.
So the big question is, how did things get this bad, this fast? Well, this crisis wasn't an accident, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the direct result of a rapid chain of events that started with a military operation thousands of miles away. It's time to trace how those dominoes fell.
And that chain reaction was shockingly swift. It starts on January 3rd, when a US intervention in Venezuela effectively cuts off Cuba's main source of oil. Just a few weeks later, an executive order basically tells the rest of the world, don't even think about selling them fuel. By February, US ships are actively blocking tankers. And then, on March 16th, the inevitable happens. The entire national power grid just collapses.
Let's be clear about what this was. It wasn't just a sanction. It was a de facto blockade. The New York Times pointed out that this was the most effective US blockade of Cuba since the incredibly tense days of the missile crisis way back in 1962. That's the kind of historical weight we're talking about here.
With the island completely paralyzed, plunged into darkness, the US administration made its goal perfectly clear. This pressure campaign, this squeeze, wasn't just about oil anymore. It was about using a humanitarian crisis as leverage to force a political change.
And right here, you can see the two realities on a collision course. On one side, you have Washington's stated goal, regime change by the end of 2026. On the other side, you have the reality for 11 million Cubans, a humanitarian disaster so severe, the UN warned their entire society was nearing a critical point.
There's no room for interpretation here. The message from the White House was blunt, and it was public. As the BBC reported, this wasn't some subtle diplomatic dance. This was an ultimatum, plain and simple. And it was designed to force the Cuban government into a corner where it had almost no good options left. The pressure was felt everywhere, even choking the most vibrant part of Cuba's economy, its small but growing private sector. These businesses, which were a real beacon of hope for so many, were suddenly facing total annihilation. A study by the AUGE consultancy found that a jaw-dropping 96.4% of private businesses were at risk of catastrophic failure. We're talking over 8,900 businesses just wiped out.
So when you're backed into a corner like that, facing a total social and economic collapse, what do? You negotiate. And that's exactly what the Cuban government did. They entered into quiet, desperate talks that would lead to the single biggest concession they could possibly put on the table.
You can see the transaction laid out right here. First, the secret talks begin. Then, in mid-March, a little goodwill gesture. 51 prisoners are released. But that's just the appetizer. The main course comes on April 3rd, with the pardon of over 2,000 people. And what happens almost immediately after? A Russian oil tanker is allowed to dock. The blockade eases. It was a classic quid pro quo, human lives in exchange for fuel.
Which brings us right back to where we started, to that mother's joyful embrace. Only now, we understand the heartbreaking context behind it. That reunion wasn't just a pardon. It was the price Cuba had to pay to prevent a complete societal meltdown. It was, quite literally, the price of keeping the lights on. The events of 2026 serve as this really stark reminder of how an action in one country can trigger an impossible choice in another. It forces us to ask a very difficult question. When diplomacy is conducted under this kind of extreme duress and a solution is reached, what is the true lasting cost of that peace?